Well, our story this morning in Genesis picks up where we left off last week. Back in chapter 37, between Joseph's arrogant behavior and his father's favoritism, the older brothers get upset enough at Joseph that they sell him as a slave to a passing caravan of merchants. They were basically traveling merchants. They were the door-to-door salesmen of their day. Most of their trade would have been in spices and other light things that sold for a great price, and that's how they made good business. But being the good businessmen that they are, they never missed an opportunity to make an extra few dollars. As they carried their spices on their caravan route, it seems that Joseph's brothers were willing to sell Joseph at a good price. They saw a bargain, they buy Joseph as a slave, and they take Joseph with him into Egypt. And when our text opens today, the caravan of traders is referred to as Ishmaelites. This is not a contradiction in the text. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites were often referred to interchangeably by those two names. As chapter 39 begins, the caravan arrives in Egypt, and Joseph is sold as a slave to a man called Potiphar. We're not told how the sale would have happened, but it surely would not have been very comforting to Joseph. In the worst possible scenarios, we know that in many of these large Egyptian towns, there would have been a slave market. It is entirely likely that as the caravan arrived in Egypt, they would have found their way to the slave market on the day of an auction. At auction, Joseph would have been stripped naked, put on the bidding block, and there would have been a bidding war to see who would get to have him as a slave. Some think that because Potiphar is the higher-ranking officials, it's possible that the savvy merchants, before going to the slave market, went to the rich houses first to see if they could get top dollar for their merchandise. And so it's also possible that they went right to Potiphar's house and to several of the other high-ranking officials. But whichever way it went, perhaps somewhere in the middle, imagine what it would have been like for Joseph. Not a comforting moment in a foreign land, sold as a piece of merchandise. Within the matter of just a couple of weeks, the spoiled 17-year-old brat has gone from being a privileged, entitled young man in his father's house to slavery in a strange land where nobody knows him and nobody cares for him. He's left behind the brightly colored tunic that his father made for him, and it's very possible that he winds up in Egypt wearing a simple loincloth or the very simple material that a slave would have worn. But the text tells us today that right from the very start, the Lord is with Joseph. And the text makes that very clear through a couple of unusual ways. Different portions of the first 5 books of the Old Testament use different names for God. For many decades, scholars thought that this reflected the fact that there are 4 or 5 different manuscript traditions that got brought together and that some editor sort of grouped all this together in the first 5 books of Moses, and there was a theory that each of the different names for God was part of a different manuscript. We now know that this was not the case. We have pretty well put that theory to bed. Unfortunately, many of our seminaries and university theology professors who've had tenure for the last 30 years still treat this theory as if it was true, but we now know that it's been entirely discredited. So what we know is that as we reach the different passages of the book of Genesis, as it uses a different name for God in different circumstances, it does that to make a point. In chapter 39, as Joseph arrives alone in Egypt, the God who watches over him is referred by the most private and personal name that he has. He's called Yahweh. The complete story of Joseph stretches from chapter 37 to chapter 50 of Genesis. This is the only chapter where God is referred to by his personal, private name of Yahweh. And it's done to make a point that as Joseph feels his loneliness and his isolation, sold as a slave in Egypt, the God who is with him is not the distant, powerful creator. He's not the divinity who lives in inapproachable light. He is the personal God who has a personal name, who makes himself known to Joseph. And then Joseph isn't sold into slavery just anywhere. He is sold into a house that God has picked for him, that is awaiting him, and where his fortunes will turn. Genesis chapter 39, and starting at verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house. and he put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now, what happens to Joseph as he arrives in Egypt should be an encouragement to any committed Christian who works in the secular world around us. The world we live in is very secular, it's very godless, and it often feels like everything around us is opposed to Christian values. But time and time again, Christians who are hardworking, in discipline, and who live in the secular world by their spiritual values become a source of blessing. In Joseph's case, the success and the blessing he brings on Potiphar's house is in no small measure a fulfillment of the promise that God had first made to Abraham. Remember what God had said to Abraham: through you and your descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Joseph begins that fulfillment. He is the child, the descendant of Abraham, and as he comes to Egypt and to Potiphar's house, that house is blessed because of his presence. The same idea is embodied a little bit later as the Israelites are sent into captivity into Egypt. Jeremiah writes them a letter and he prays for them, and he says, you know what? He says, when you get to Babylon, don't be upset and sour and counterproductive. Collaborate with the people around you. Pray for the good of the city where you are. Work for the good of that city. They're called to be productive and collaborating, contributing to the good of people around them. Eventually, Potiphar trusted Joseph with all of his possessions, all that he had. And it's expressed with a very strange Hebrew word in verse 6. The Hebrew word that's used in verse 6 is the word for abandoning. It says that literally Potiphar trusted Joseph so much that he abandoned all of his goods to Joseph's keeping. Here's the keys to the house. Here's the keys to the office. Here's the keys to the car. Here's the car. Here's the account book. Here's the bank book. Joseph had everything entrusted into his hands. Very intriguing side comments. It said that the only thing that Potiphar had to worry about was what he ate. We think this is a comment about Joseph's diet. We think that Joseph, very much like Daniel, as he goes to Egypt, would have preferred to keep the diet that he was used to, and maybe a little bit more sane, a little less abusive of the rich fats and the wine and the other things. And I get the feeling that Potiphar saw what Joseph liked to eat, and he said, okay, I'm going to trust you with everything else, but I'm still planning my own menu. Thank you very much. But the level of trust is really startling, especially if we do the math with what follows. Last week, we are told that Joseph was 17. About 10 years will go by the point he's trusted with everything in Potiphar's house. This is a young man of 27 years of age. He's a foreigner. He's come to Egypt as a slave, and now he's entrusted with all of this without reserve. Before we get to the relationship issue at the heart of our text today, I want to make just a passing note, an observation that applies to many of us this morning. It's a powerful reminder for us as believers, particularly when we're working for companies and for bosses that aren't always fair to us, where the work is hard and tedious and repetitive and demanding. There's a neat repetition in verse 2 and 3. It makes an interesting point about the way Potiphar understood what was happening. Verse 2 says that the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. And then verse 3 repeats the same information, but from Potiphar's perspective. And it says, verse 3 says, Joseph's master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord created all that he did to succeed. As you work in a secular company, as Joseph worked, you not only want to do the right thing because it matters to God, but you want to do the right thing in a way that your boss realizes that you're not an ordinary worker. And you want your boss to understand the reason you're being blessed is not just because you're good looking and intelligent and everything else, but the reason why you're successful and you do as well as you do is because there's somebody watching over you and the Lord is guiding you and directing you. I remember for the many years that I worked at Québécois, one of the things I tried to find when I was there were other believers who worked in Québécois. At that point, Québécois had a little over 30,000 employees, and in my several years there, I only found one other believer who worked in one of the warehouses. And it was very powerful to me that as I prayed for the place where I worked, I got the feeling that there are probably just two of us praying for Québécois. And there where you are, the Lord is calling you to work for the good of those that you work for, of those that work with you. You want people around you to know that as you succeed, as you do well, as you work hard and you work diligently, it's not just about your skill, it is about the Lord that is blessing you and guiding you and directing you. Well, verse 6 becomes our transitional verse in the text. We stopped halfway through verse 6. As we continue with the second half of verse 6 in a moment, it tells us that Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. This is not a compliment that the Hebrew text gives lightly or gives often. In English, we use a different word for men and for women. We say that men are handsome and women are beautiful. We use different terms for different sexes. In Hebrew, there's just the one word. But there's two phrases that are used here, and it's an interesting combination. We're told that Joseph was handsome both in form and in appearance. This double phrase is only used one other time in the Scriptures. The Hebrew expression beautiful in form was used to describe David's wife Abigail in 1 Samuel 25. Beautiful in form is also used to describe Esther in the book of Esther. And then the other piece, being beautiful in appearance, it's used a little more often. It's used of Abraham's wife Sarah. It's used of David in 1 Samuel. And it's used of David's daughter Tamar. But there's only one other person in the book of Genesis who's described as being beautiful both in form and in appearance. Interestingly, it was Rachel, Joseph's mother. So it seems that in terms of physical appearance, the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree. Joseph takes after his mother, and we're told he's beautiful in form and in appearance. That probably means that he was working out at the gym, that he took care of his skin, and did all of the things he needed to do, but he was a good-looking guy. And that's where the troubles begin. Genesis 39, and we'll read the rest of the chapter. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in his house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge. He's not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And she spoke to Joseph day after day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her, to be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left the garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment beside her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. On October 15th, 2017, Alyssa Milano started a whirlwind of controversy with a single tweet that would eventually be repeated and retweeted over 19 million times. After having carried the weight and shame of what she had lived through trying to succeed in Hollywood as an actress, She came forward about what she'd suffered at the hands of powerful movie mogul Harvey Weinstein with a tweet that invited a response. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write "Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. The original post came around noon that day, but by the end of that first day, over 200,000 people had responded in kind. Eventually, 19 million people would follow suit. I understand that many now feel that the Me Too movement has maybe gone a little too far, but it has highlighted certainly just how widespread the problem was and how secretively it was kept for so many years. Unfortunately, when preachers deal with the text that we've just read, the tendency is to deal with it strictly from Joseph's perspective as an encouragement for Christian people to strive for sexual purity. And we want to deal with some of those issues in a moment. It shouldn't be lost on us that faced with a compromising situation, Joseph didn't hesitate. He got up, he ran, he fled. The text tells us 2 or 3 times that he ran out of the house as fast as he could. Now, there are some things about physical intimacy and about the way we guard our bodies that are completely in our control. For some of you, I realize there have been moments where you were not in control and where you were taken advantage of. The power differential between Joseph and Potiphar's wife in our story is part of what makes the details painful. Potiphar was a very powerful man. And as his literal slave, Joseph's fate lies entirely in his hands. Potiphar had power literally of life and death over Joseph. And that colors dramatically the balance of power between Joseph and his master's wife. This is the kind of differential that's at the heart of most cases of physical and sexual abuse. It's important to acknowledge that this morning because statistics tell us that even by conservative estimates, almost half of women and about 1/3 of men at some point in their lives will have been placed in this kind of awkward situation where something is required, requested, demanded of them that they hesitate to refuse. I want you to know that through Joseph's story and repeatedly through the rest of the text of Scriptures, the Lord acknowledges the pain that you have lived, and He acknowledges it with sympathy and with understanding. Something peculiar happens in Luke 17. In that text, the Lord doesn't specifically refer to sexual abuse, but He includes it as He takes the little child and He places the child in their midst. And He tells the disciples, if anyone does harm to one of the least of these little ones, it would be better for him if a millstone were placed around his neck and he was thrown into the depths of the sea. That's how God expresses His displeasure and His judgment on those who take advantage of those vulnerable. The Lord doesn't speak often in harsh terms like this. It's very telling that He reserves one of His harshest statements for someone who takes advantage of, who harms or abuses a little child. At the end of January 2018, there's a young gymnast called Rachel Den Hollander who made a heartbreaking, impassioned appeal at the sentence hearing for Dr. Larry Nassar. He'd been one of the osteopathic physicians for the American gymnastic team. Rachel had been the first to speak out, but then dozens of other young women came forward to speak out about the hidden abuse that they'd all suffered at the hands of this team doctor. It had started when many of them were very young. After Nassar was convicted, in her testimony at the sentencing hearing, Rachel asked a soul-searching question. Here's just a few lines from her speech that day. I ask that you hand down a sentence that tells us that what was done matters, that we are known, that we are worth everything, that we are worth the greatest protection that the law can offer, the greatest measure of justice available. And to everyone who's watching, I ask the same question: how much is a little girl worth? In view of the enormity of the crimes, Dr. Nassar was given a sentence of 175 years. Remember the judgment of the Lord Jesus, that it would be better for such an individual to have a millstone placed around their neck. Before I go any further this morning into a story I know will cause some discomfort for some of you, I thought it was important to acknowledge this for 2 reasons. First, because it's possible and perhaps even likely that some of you within the sound of my voice this morning are even now in a situation where someone is taking advantage of a power differential like this, and you're being subjected to some things that you do not want. And I want you to hear clearly from me this morning that this is not right, that you have done nothing to deserve this, and that it needs to stop today. It needs to stop now. And if for some reason you're in a relationship where there's violence, where there's unwanted advances, and you don't know how to get out, reach out to me. Reach out to someone you know. There are people around who are here to help you. And secondly, I wanted to acknowledge this because I want you to know that you are not alone, and you don't need to carry this alone. When I was a very young boy, just in grade 1, because of difficult, unforeseen circumstances with the place where we lived with my parents, I spent some time, almost a year and a half, in an orphanage where things did not go well. What I experienced was light compared to what many others face, but I lived through things that no little boy my age should have been exposed to. Those things have left their mark, and I still carry part of it, but I've come to the point of healing with the Lord's grace. And much of the healing has come from the certainty that the Lord knows and understands that kind of pain. But a large part of it has come because I have a few close friends who know and who've walked the road of healing with me. If this is a struggle that you carry because of something that's happening now or something that happened in the past, the Lord knows and understands, but it's tremendously helpful to find one or two people with whom you can have the kind of conversation you need to have. There are counselors that I trust in the city to whom I can refer you. Please speak to me. There's no reason for you to carry this alone. Father, this morning I just want to interrupt and take a moment in the middle of the sermon to bring to you those who have suffered this kind of trauma in the past, perhaps some who are still struggling with it now. Father, bring them the comfort of your understanding and of your care. Father, help them to take that courageous step to speak to someone who will be able to walk the difficult road with them towards healing. In Christ's name, amen. But let's get back to the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife for a moment. She is relentless in her advances. She wants this young man. And commentators suggest different reasons why this is happening. There's an unsubstantiated suggestion that maybe Potiphar, as happened with many of the other Pharaoh's servants, maybe Potiphar was a eunuch, they suggest. Certainly the servants who took care of the harem, who took care of the close personal business of the Pharaoh, by tradition were eunuchs, but nothing tells us that that was Potiphar's situation. In fact, much to the contrary, he appears to have a family. The bottom line appears to be this. This woman had a little too much time in her hands. She lived a life of luxury and ease. Her husband apparently had provided everything she needed, and she had little to do. She was handed everything she wanted by her husband, and her husband was probably too busy and too often out of the house. She's alone, she's lonely, she wants company, and she's not used to anybody saying no to her. Add to that the casualness with which sexual things and immorality were treated in Egypt. And of course, the fact that Joseph wasn't hard to look at would have compounded the problem. It's not without reason that verse 6 makes that the turning point in the story, commenting on how good Joseph looked. And beyond the physical attraction, many women are just attracted to successful men who just seem to have it all together. By any measure, Joseph was quite a catch. And a repeated appeal to Joseph is very, very direct. In the original Hebrew, it's almost to the point of making the text R-rated or X-rated because of what she asks of Joseph over and over again. It's very, very clear what she has in mind. And of course, the question that much of the secular world around us would have as they look at the story would be, who's it going to hurt? What would be the harm? Joseph is unmarried, he's unattached, he's a handsome young man. It certainly doesn't appear that he's getting this kind of attention from anybody else. The woman is a consenting adult who's clearly been neglected by her husband. She's a wealthy woman who probably took care of herself. I'm sure she was pretty good looking herself. If I work hard at it, I can read through the text and come up with at least a dozen good reasons why Joseph should have said yes, and I'm sure you can too, and certainly the world around us would say yes. But Joseph knows differently. And in his refusal to the woman, to Potiphar's wife, he gives two reasons for the refusal. And the first reason for the refusal actually points a finger very strongly back at Potiphar's wife. The first thing Joseph says to Potiphar's wife is, how could I break my master's trust? I work for this man. He's my boss. He's my master. I'm his employee. He trusts me. How could I break his trust? The underlying question is, you're married to the man. How could you break your trust with him? A couple of weeks ago, I was telling you about the fact that I'm very uncomfortable with the way young people, as they get married, they lighten the vows that they make to each other. You make me happy, you make my heart flutter, I like the way you bat your eyelashes at me, and I hope I get to spend the rest of my life being happy with you together somewhere in a nice house with a good job. But the wedding vows make a stronger commitment. And as Joseph speaks to Potiphar's wife about wanting to be true and loyal to the commitment he has to his boss, he is saying to Potiphar's wife, what about your vow? What about the promises that you have made? What about your loyalty to your husband? But there's a second reason that Joseph gives to refuse her advances, and this one is even more powerful. Joseph simply asks this question, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Repeatedly throughout the scriptures, sin that brings physical intimacy outside the bonds of marriage are clearly referred to as a sin against God. And our modern culture says, wait, back the truck up here. We're just having fun for a few minutes under the sheet. You know, love is love. And you know, God is love, and he wants us to love. He must be happy whenever love is expressed, however it's expressed, because God is love and we're just loving each other. And the world around us, as you know, is increasingly frustrated when Christians stand and say that there are actually limits on how love should be appropriately physically expressed. What's wrong with all those bigoted Christians who keep wanting to make all these rules about sex? But the reality is that even the world around us realizes that there has to be limits somewhere. The more than 19 million people who retweeted Alyssa Milano's Me Too text would say that. The people who heard with repulsion the details of what that doctor did to the young ladies on that gymnastic team would confirm there is a line. And there's several other issues that have arisen that have led to great and growing discomfort about love and physical intimacy and the rules governing that part of our lives. The world thought they had it figured out one point when they said, well, basically, if it happens between two consenting adults, it's okay. But now we have problems with even that definition. There's a growing movement that is gaining ground towards accepting what's being called polyamory. That's a relationship between more than two people. There's actually a lobby in Quebec pushing the government to recognize marriages with 3 people and more. And then has come this recent, really startling discovery. You know that generation that's just about to be married, between teenage and married, that used to be the ones that were adventurous with physical relationship, to put it mildly? Well, it turns out that today this generation is not doing that anymore because they've got a bunch of worries. And it's not just COVID that's brought the restriction. They all have the same concern. The definition was if it's between 2 consenting adults, it's okay, but now we're having a hard time figuring out what does consent mean. And several very public law cases have now shown us that even when somebody says yes, it doesn't always mean yes. And even when somebody gives consent, you can never be sure that it's really consent. And so maybe it's a good thing. It's made everybody a little bit more cautious about just who they jump into the sheets with. Ultimately, the reason Christians and the reason God places such a tight restrictions on intimacy is not because we don't like it, not because we're prudish, not because it's a bad thing, but God places restrictions on it because he values what it is. I've told you about my friend who runs the little Avis dealership just down here, and he knows I'm a pastor, he knows I'm a priest or a rabbi or something, and every time I go to rent a car, he tries to treat me really nicely. and he always bumps me up to another category. I pay for the little econo box, and sometimes that's what I get. But when I'm there and he's got something else available, he always bumps me up another class, another category higher. And I remember I went to see him one time, and he's got 2 BMWs in part of the car park that he's got. And one of them is this beautiful white 500 series BMW with the fog lights and the leather seat and everything. And on this day, I needed to rent a car to do food bank deliveries. And I was going to some rough areas of town, and I was going to load a bunch of groceries in the back of the car. And I thought, there's no way I want to do this to this beautiful white BMW. And I told him, I'm sorry. I said, I can't. Not today. Because God makes rules around this. It tells us how much he values it. Love and intimacy are one of the most beautiful things God has created. It has the power to draw married couples together in a unique and exclusive way like nothing else, that tells them that they have a relationship that's exclusive, that's unmatched by any other friendship. This intimacy is the mysterious and magical process that God uses to create new little living souls that will live for eternity. And it's because this is so precious that God surrounds it with so much care and with loving restrictions placed there for our own good. So when God says that this kind of intimacy is to be shared exclusively by one man and one woman who've made a lifelong commitment to each other, it's not because he's a prudish spoilsport. It's because he knows the value of this, and it needs to be protected. There are a couple more details in our text that I wanted to note with you before we end this morning, because the end of the story makes a really powerful point. I'm always struck by the craftiness with which Potiphar's wife handles the situation when she doesn't get what she wants. She's waited till she's alone in the house with Joseph. She grabs his coat, and as he leaves, then she has to make up a story in a hurry. So she starts with the staff. Now, you got to think about the staff here. Joseph has just arrived. He's some foreign Hebrew slave. He's 17 years old when he arrives, and in a matter of a couple of years, he's leading the whole house. He's in charge of everybody, including all of the other servants. I'm sure there's a couple of the other servants who were a little jealous of Joseph's position. I'm sure there's a few other slaves in the house who thought, what in the world was Potiphar thinking by taking this 17-year-old Hebrew slave and putting him in charge of the whole house and in charge of us? And so she uses that to her advantage. Before her husband gets home, she recruits all the other sets. You know, this is what happened, right? He came to me and I yelled out and he tried to, and they're all in on it. Now, the very telling thing is Potiphar's reaction to all this. We have indications from other sources that both in Egypt and other countries at the time, adultery was punishable by execution. And the accusation made against Joseph is much worse than just adultery. She essentially accuses the slave of attempting to rape her. That was a serious allegation. Normally, what would have happened when Potiphar got home is that this slave would have been executed. But that's not what happened. Verse 19 says that when Potiphar heard what his wife said, his anger was kindled. But did you notice it doesn't tell us who he's angry at? My guess is that this is not the first time that Mr. Potiphar's wife tries something funny. And instead of having Joseph summarily executed as he ordinarily would have, he has him confined. Now, our English uses the word imprisoned, but in Hebrew there's a different word for confinement, for prison, and for dungeon. And it's varying levels of depth and darkness. And Joseph is not placed in the dungeon, and he's not imprisoned, he's confined. About the equivalent word to house arrest. Pretty light punishment considering the serious crime he's supposed to have done. And not only is he confined, he's not sent to the dungeon, he's sent to the prison where we're told that the king's prisoners were kept. These are the white-collar criminals. This is not the hard-working penal colony. Joseph is essentially under house arrest with other white-collar criminals. As awkward as it seems to be, the story seems to suggest that Potiphar trusted Joseph more than he trusted his own wife. He was no fool. He was fully aware of what was happening in his house. And all of this prepares the way for the rest of the story and for God's good plan to unfold. In that prison, Joseph will make connections. He'll rise to prominence again. He'll be doing the right thing. And soon he'll be out of the prison, eventually working way to be prime minister of Egypt. I read a little while ago about a critic of the Bible who said that he didn't like the Bible because it told all these impossible stories. And somebody pushed him, okay, name one story in the Bible that's impossible. He said, take the story of Joseph. He says, how can you conceive that somebody would go from jail to being prime minister of the country? And the response was, have you ever heard of Nelson Mandela? Robben Island, South Africa. Does that ring a bell at all? Joseph has come a long way from the arrogant, bratish, spoiled 17-year-old teenager with his brothers. I wonder whether the entitled young man back home would have had the nerve to resist the temptation today. I wonder whether the young man who had been so ready to stretch the truth to get his brothers in trouble, I wonder whether he would have walked the road of integrity that Joseph walks today. As Joseph resisted the temptation of immediate gratification, as he worked diligently and ethically in a way that God would bless him, the Lord did. In our relationships, in the relationships that we long for, in the work that we do, we're so focused on the short term. We want the immediate gratification. And we forget that the Lord works at a much slower pace than we do. While Joseph was working as a slave and working his way up, while Joseph was imprisoned, that whole time, God was behind the scenes doing his work, preparing things to bring Joseph to the point where he wanted. I'm sure there have been moments where Joseph was a little impatient at the speed at which God was working. Japanese theologian Kosuke Koyama made several interesting contributions to Protestant theology. He contributed to the conversation between Buddhism and Christianity, and that was fed in part by the years he spent as a missionary in Thailand. And he wrote several books, and he's an author who has this knack to come up with interesting titles for his book. One of his first books was called Water Buffalo Theology. It's not about Veggie Tales. Water buffalo theology is named that way because in Buddhism, water buffaloes are important characters. And so he wrote this book about how Christians and Buddhists need to learn to speak to each other and hear each other. One of his last works was entitled, The Cross Has No Handles. It argues that most of us don't realize the important work that suffering and struggle play in our lives. But my favorite of his book titles was called simply The 3 Mile an Hour God. The 3 Mile an Hour God. 3 miles an hour is the average speed at which the average human being walks. That's our average walking speed, 3 miles an hour. And in his book, Koyama says that we're always in a rush for God to do things fast, now, today. Part of that comes because there's so much we can do instantaneously online. We have little tolerance for the long process, for reflection, for delayed gratification. But Koyama argues that God slows the process down to our speed. And he walks alongside us at 3 miles an hour. And relationships develop slowly and gradually, healthily, over time. And sometimes we spend years in jobs that we don't like, not realizing that while we're doing that awful job for the terrible boss we can't stand, that slowly at 3 miles an hour, God is shaping our character and preparing us for the next step. God knows the future. More than that, he's planned the future. And it's in his sovereign control. And as we walk towards it, we can't go any faster than the human pace at which we live. Our 3 miles an hour. And God walks with us at 3 miles an hour, doing what needs to be done, changing our character and preparing us as we go. Before closing hymn, I wanted to give you just a moment of reflection. For some of you this morning, the way Joseph resisted that temptation spoke to your heart. Some of you are struggling with relationships in which you should not be involved. Some of you are struggling with relationships with your computer screen that should not be happening. And the Lord asks us to walk in purity as believers. The choir is just going to sing a short piece for us. It's called Refiner's Fire. It's a prayer to the Lord that he would purify our hearts. Would you remain seated as the choir sings? If there are things that you need to speak to the Lord about the way you're resisting and responding to temptation, take a moment to do that. Father, this morning as we close, I come with several requests. First, for those again who have been hurt by intimacy in the past and who carry that struggle and that weight. Father, I pray that you would bring them to a place of healing, knowing that you understand, that you've seen what has been done. Father, I pray that they would find solace and comfort in someone that they trust. Father, I want to pray this morning for some perhaps who've been on the other side of this kind of relationship where they have taken advantage of a relationship that they had. Father, I pray that you would bring contrition and conviction. Father, for those of us who are struggling in our relationships, for those of us who are longing for relationships, for those of us who are married who want to glorify you in the way things are between us, we just ask for your wisdom and your guidance. Father, you are the 3-mile-an-hour God. You come and you walk alongside us at our pace. We're grateful for your presence there. Often we'd like the process to go a little faster. Teach us patience as you build our character through the temptations that we face, through hard circumstances. Father, make us the kind of people that you would have us be, who look like your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, in his beauty, in his purity, in his holiness, and his compassion. This is our prayer in his name. Amen.